What's good, everybody? It's Joe, Matsu Excel. You're probably asking, why am I not using my hands? Well, one, I'm holding a light because I'm using the GoPro to record this, but I have my setup in the back here, and I wanted to talk about how I use that Nikon Z30 for my streaming camera. Now, I posted a short. I got a lot of attention. I talked about why it really wasn't a streaming camera, but I may have been wrong. But it did require some setting changing, but you know what? Let's just get into it. Let's talk about the Nikon Z30. I put out a short a couple months ago when I first got this camera saying that this is not a streaming camera. And off the bat, it isn't necessarily the best streaming camera. With the Nikon utility app where you can connect it to your computer, you can't use it as a full HD 1080p camera. Like right off the bat, it doesn't get recognized automatically. The app is really clunky. It's not the greatest image, but you can use the camera as a streaming camera with this setup. So I'm actually recording this video through OBS, and I'm using an Nikon Z30, and it's at 1080p 60 frames a second. Normal, not high, higher bit rate. It's just the standard 1080 60 output going through an HDMI capture card. And this is the best way to utilize your Nikon Z30 as a streaming camera without any overheating. Now, hopefully, there will be some update with firmware. I know there's pending firmware because of a newer power zoom lens that's coming out, but I don't know if that's going to necessarily address the overheating issue. This camera is really capable of 4K 30. I've actually used it for a lot of different clips as far as for 4K 24. And it's a good budget. You can actually buy, I think right now it's on sale for $6.99 with this stock lens. It's a 16 to 50 millimeter. It's a crop sensor, of course, but it does start with at least a 3.5 aperture rating. And you can see right here with some basic lighting setup, it looks pretty nice. And this is what I use normally for my streaming setup. So it's definitely something you could look at and utilize, especially if you are a Nikon shooter and you like capturing the colors that Nikon does get. Yes, right now Sony is the biggest name of the game. Canon's coming up. But as far as for a streaming setup for my Nikon shooters who are out there who use Nikon but you want to get into streaming or get into anything like that, this camera is still really good and it does really well. So some of the things that I learned while using the Nikon Z30 for streaming was if I left it at 4K, whether it was 24 or 4K 30, that the camera would overheat at about 45 minutes. I wasn't recording in body or anything like that. It was just straight the camera staying on through power through USB-C, and it would last about 40 to 45 minutes before it shut down and overheated. There's no way you could run the camera with USB-C power without the battery in it. I've tried that. I thought that might be able to help reduce it. I thought about buying like an external heat sink to try to see if I could compensate for that. But so far, nothing that I could really think of without like using a 3D printer would be sufficient enough. I'm sure that if you could find a way to keep it cool internally, it could last that long. However, the secret hack for it was using the USB power, and you could go 1080 60. Now, I am curious though, if I wasn't using USB-C charging, because what it's doing is, it's charging it through at the same time, and it's running off the battery, but it's charging it. So the question is, can a dummy battery, which wasn't available at the time, be sufficient to run 4K 30? It's a possibility, but I have been able to use 4K 30 with something like a GoPro that didn't overheat. That is one option, but it's not always the greatest option. At 1080p 60, it's still an amazing camera, and you can put different lenses. So right now, this is just the stock lens. Like, let's say I wanted to bring it a little bit closer. Now, one of the things that it is an issue because the stock lens itself. Here, hold up. The one thing though, because it's a zoom and it's not a fixed aperture. So when you do zoom in, you do get a higher aperture. So you do have to either introduce more light into the scene, and you also get a bigger depth of field. So a lot of the background you can see here is not blurred. However, I could easily adapt different glass on it and get that better background blur, that bokeh effect, better lighting. If I wanted to buy a cheap, just a non-autofocus lens, I could do so. Like, the cool thing about this is it is autofocus. It's really good. The nice thing about the cropped Nikons, it's not, if you're comparing it like for photography, stuff like that, it's not going to hit like currently Canon or Sony with their autofocus features. But for something like streaming or content creation like this, if I want to hold up a product and be like, hey, take a look at this, it's really quick to focus, right? And then it'll just focus right on me. So that's kind of the cool part about it. I mean, the thing is, when you buy a camera, especially like if you're barely getting into photography or videography, you don't want to spend that much money on a body like itself. Like that's why most people, when they start streaming, they'll buy something like an A6400, even if it's used, or A6600, just because you get that clean HDMI out. And that's the one nice things about this Nikon Z30 and all the newer Nikon cameras, and most cameras these days, they do have a clear video out. And the cool thing about it is, if I did want to record this like straight to the card versus record it through OBS, I could do so, and it'll record. It actually has no time limit, like where a lot of cameras, some cameras still today have like that 30-minute or like 29-minute, 59-second timer. So the camera will automatically stop when you're recording, and then you have to like kind of actually pace yourself when you're making different things. Like when I make YouTube videos, I love using this camera, and I use it more this for video than my Z6, because I get the same kind of quality, same kind of color accuracy that I get with my Nikon setups, and I can switch lenses out, which is an amazing thing. Like one of the coolest things, like if I wanted to add, I could add a 24mm camera to this and get some of that same awesome tone, and also a lot better, bokeh, blur out, and all that stuff. And it's totally, it's perfect. And I can adapt old glass to it. So I used to use a Nikon D5500, and now I can use those same lenses with a mount adapter with this camera, and it's really cool. Now, you're probably wondering, well, how's it set up? So one of the things that I actually don't have a camera here because it's being used, I use an Elgato cam link. Now you could buy this cam link. It's usually for like $120, $109, depends on the sale, through Elgato or on Amazon. I'll have a link down there. But you can use something really cheap, like one of these cheap little capture cards. If you want to take a look at this video on this up here, after this, click on that, and I'll talk to you about all my favorite cheap capture cards. But you can use any kind of capture card, hook it up to OBS, it's automatically recognized as a video camera, and a lot of those will process that 4K video. It will downscale it, and it will record at a 1080. But again, even if you were streaming on Twitch, unless you're streaming on like YouTube and you're really doing 4K video, most platforms you can only really put out 1080, 60 frames. So you're going to get a better quality. Like if you want to zoom in and stuff like that, you could get a good zoom, still quality, crispness, but it's not going to necessarily affect your output, because it's all going to get output at 1080p most of the time, especially if you're dealing with like bitrate and stuff like that. But I'm not going to explain all that. So for people who said, like, even myself, when I first got this, I was like, oh, okay, this is not a streaming camera, but it can be. You just have to make some adaptations. Once you're able to adapt to it, you can make it your streaming camera. If you have any questions about that, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, hopefully you guys found this video enjoyable, and I'll catch you next time. Peace out.